Now, when I look at pictures of prolific serial killers like Dahmer, if I were to see him on the street, just another white guy. Now, BTK, yes, he appeared to be some grumpy old man, but serial killer, not really. Pedo, at best. Now, the poster boy himself, Ted Bundy. If you showed me his mugshot, I might guess B-list celebrity, getting into trouble, maybe caught with some cocaine or whatnot. But when Zac Efron can play you in a movie, you're not looking that menacing. And then we have Richard Ramirez. Now, without context, I recall seeing his face, and there was just something so off-putting about it. Something behind the eyes, or maybe something lacking in the eyes, right? They say psychopaths have a lack of empathy, but like I gave you examples before, you couldn't really tell in some serial killers, but Richard Ramirez, he was that guy you did not want to run into in a dark alley, in a lit alley, in an open public. He was just a person that you instinctively just didn't want to come across, because he could step on a roach with his left foot and step on your throat with his right foot, and the difference to him would be negligible. And today we're going to take a trip, and I'm going to tell you it's a real trip, as we delve into the twisted mind of what the media dubbed the Night Stalker. And I don't know if it would surprise you, he started off as a regular, well-behaved, happy kid. So what happened to him along the way? My name is Monks, and as horrifying a person as Richard Ramirez was, I would have to admit that he has probably the best serial killer name of all time. It was the GOAT. Sadly, I have to use my phone today because my Samsung Galaxy, if you can see from over there, will not turn on. Ricardo Ramirez was born on February 29th, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 siblings and mainly referred to as Richard. His parents were Julian and Mercedes Ramirez, and they were both from Juarez, Mexico. Now, family members would recall that he was a cheerful and well-behaved child. Richard was just being a kid. Now, if you think about it that way, he was trying to just have as much fun as he could. His immediate family was plagued with domestic violence, turmoil, anxiety. Every corner of the Ramirez household, there was no escape from violence. And it all stemmed from his father, Julian. Now, Julian, once upon a time, was a proud policeman in Juarez, Mexico. And even then, he was known for his wicked temper and his short fuse. Now, he was in America, El Paso, and he was working on the Santa Fe Railroad, which left him tired and very quick to anger, as always. And you could just imagine that a job like that is not going to be very helpful in managing his anger. And being the youngest of 5 kids, you could say that Richard pretty much entered into this volatile world of physical abuse, and it just became a part of everyday life. But because he was an easy target, being so young, his father would often abuse him specifically in unimaginable way. And if we think about it, I guess that kind of explains why people remembered young Richard as being polite and well-behaved, because he was probably always worried that if he did anything out of pocket, he probably would get his lights knocked out that night. And of course, as the old adage goes, you can't choose your family. And Richard was definitely served a bad hand when given such a horrible, heartless father, but the family tree was rotting. And this again would bring him another family figure in his life in the form of an older cousin named Miguel Ramirez. He was this decorated United States Army Green Beret. He's been on many tours, seen many battles, and even proudly served in the Vietnam War. Now, he would come home and regale to anybody that would listen his numerous stories about the atrocities of war. But what he would leave out for the majority part of his audience was that he contributed to a number of those atrocities that he spoke of. And for some reason, maybe it was this intense look in Richard's eyes, how he was paying attention so closely at maybe the morbid stories part, that he took Richard aside and gave him a different version of these stories. Miguel would tell of how he would invade villages, murdering countless Vietnamese families, and the awful things he would force the women he had captured to do with him, for him, and what he would do to them. But pictures, of course, are worth 1,000 words. So not only did Cousin Miguel come back with stories, he also came back with Polaroids. He would show Richard extremely graphic images of naked women, some bound and gagged, and there were even images of corpses. And to make things even worse, Miguel would even pose with the women, with the bodies, and he would tell Richard with a joy and excitement, as if he was telling Richard about a wonderful vacation he just had. Now, from this, the two started to hang out with each other more, and Miguel, in a way, became a bit of a mentor to him. Remember, Richard doesn't care about his father, and he was always looking for a male figure. Another horrifying one comes his way. Now, Richard, he would sneak out in the middle of the night and hang out with this cousin of his. Miguel would also teach him various skills that he learned during the war. Some of these things Richard would, of course, use later on in life. And one of those things was how to be stealth and how to murder efficiently. Not sure why Miguel thought it was okay to expose a 12-year-old child to this type of behavior, but when I tell you about May 4th of 1973, we're about to learn that Cousin Miguel had a few screws loose and was about to expose to a now 13-year-old Richard Ramirez something even worse. So one night, while Richard was hanging out at Miguel's house, Miguel got into an argument with his wife, Jessie. Things got really heated, so Richard, as this was going down, he would just sit there and watched. It was an all too common occurrence. Nothing new here, buddy. Except there would be something very new that would probably change the course of Richard's life forever. As he was sitting there, he also watched his cousin, Miguel, grab a .38 caliber revolver and shoot his wife directly in her face, shattering her head. Now, Richard, who was never much of a talker regardless, sat there in silence. He didn't think to help Jessie or ask Miguel why he would do something like that. He just sat there, taking in the bloody murder. Miguel would eventually be caught for this. After witnessing this horrifying murder, as one could, this would leave Richard completely incapable of connecting at all to anybody else. Miguel was his hero. Miguel was the person that he wanted to hang out with. And this, on top of being verbally and physically abused by his father, he would grow on to be more silent and more strange as time went on. Now, I want to note that Richard had two major head traumas. Now, whether it meant anything or not concerning his behavior, it's still an interesting fact to point out. So the first time, he was just 2 years old. He climbed a dresser, and because he saw a radio at the top of this dresser, 2-year-olds want that. The dresser tips, falling onto Richard's head, leading to 30 stitches on his forehead. Now, the second time was on a playground. At 5 years old, he was struck by a swing that knocked him out. My kid did that, so firsthand, I know this is what they do. They don't recognize the pendulum is going to hit them. Now, Richard, he would suffer frequent seizures following these injuries, which suggests a strong correlation. Now, Richard had an older sister named Ruth, who had already left the house and got married. She got away from that maniac father of hers. Now, on her visits, she would notice that her younger brother had become more and more isolated than before. Now, knowing that he was the literal punching bag for their father, she felt it was her duty to rescue him from this situation. She offered him a room at her house with her and her husband, Roberto. Richard jumped at the chance to escape this house. Now, the living situation at Ruth's was good until it wasn't. But it wasn't the fault of Richard. He was just in need of a positive influence during these most impressionable times. And again, I don't know why. Some people just get the shit end of the stick over and over, not giving Richard any type of excuse. He received another depraved role model. Okay, so he started hanging out with his brother-in-law, Roberto, and a bond was formed between them. And so it was one night that Roberto decides to take young Richard on, let's call it, an excursion to look into the windows of young girls and women. Roberto was a notorious peeping Tom in the neighborhood, and he knew all the houses, he knew all the times, which window to look at, and the tricks of not getting caught. Now, Richard at this point is just barely in his teens. I'm gonna say he's about 14, 15 years old, and he's already being armed with the ability to surveil his target, stalk them in the cover of darkness, stealthily maneuver without being detected, catch them off guard, incapacitate them if he needed to, take what he wants. But mentally, he wasn't at that level of depravity that he would achieve later on in life. But Roberto would again help him with this problem by introducing him to the world of drugs, experimenting with marijuana, LSD, a plethora of mind-altering hallucinogens, pretty much alleviating him, Richard I'm talking about, of all his consciousness, all things empathetic. He would find Satanism, and he realized that it fit his personality just right. Everything should be about his own pleasure, doing whatever it took to get what he wanted, but he knew there was levels to this game. At the moment, Richard and Roberto were content on doing drugs and spying on women. Now, you could say that Roberto was fine and all, but Richard would have to admit that he was no cousin Miguel. That was his favorite. But by the grace of Satan, after serving just 4 years in prison, let me remind you, Miguel shot his wife in the face. Mike's counsel was able to convince a judge that he had murdered by reason of insanity. The year is now 1977 and Richard is 17 years old. He is reunited with his cousin Miguel, so shaping his thoughts about life were two exceptionally vile men, and so Richard moves up to the next level of the game. Richard's new goal was simple: to be a supervillain. Literally, he wanted to be a supervillain. Now, I hope you guys didn't make that all too often mistake of including a high-level intelligence to the equation when concerning Mr. Ramirez here, because you will find that he did not have much of that. He began to commit some petty robberies without much tact, poor execution, and the only thing that allowed him to get away with it so many times was pure dumb luck. But of course, if you're just relying on luck, just like at the casino, that shit runs out. And he was arrested and sent to serve a stint in the youth detention center, but shortly after being released, he was sent right back for marijuana possession. And as you could imagine, as you're trying to ascend the ranks of evil, as Richard was consciously trying to do, you don't have much time for school anymore. So he drops out of that. And of course, you need the root of that evil: money. He would get himself a local job at the Holiday Inn as a housekeeper. Well, Richard must have mistaken that position as reading, "Keep what's in the house." He was stealing, now armed with unlimited power in the form of a universal passkey. Anytime he saw something of value, he would take it. And disturbingly, he would use his peeping Tom skills that he learned from Roberto and began hiding in the rooms of guesses that he found attractive. And then came a day that Richard saw something in someone's room of great value. Another man's wife. The moment that gentleman stepped away from his room, Richard let himself in, and before she could escape, he had grabbed her and was on top of her trying to commit SA. But the husband, thankfully, would return just in time to pull Richard off his wife and began beating him to within an inch of his life before the police arrived to take Richard away. Now, it was at this point that the story of Richard Ramirez could have changed significantly. Because the couple, we're not going to blame them in any sense. That couple was only in Texas for a trip, and they did not want to return to testify against him. So the charges were dropped, and he remained free. A prime example of how luck again, stupid luck, was on his side and not necessarily wit. He was extremely sloppy again. And it was because of this situation that he did feel his time in Texas was over. And unfortunately for the residents of California, something sinister had just taken up residence in one of their neighborhoods. So by the 1980s, the Californians would only get a small glimpse of this character named Richard Ramirez. He was picked up for cocaine possession and stealing cars. But by April of 1984, Richard reached that level of evil that nobody would ever come back from. So after having lived out of hotels in the uncomfortably named Tenderloin district of San Francisco, Richard had become familiar with the layouts of one of these buildings. And because of this, a 9-year-old girl named Liang, simply Linda to those that knew her, realized that she had dropped $1 while she was walking with her 8-year-old brother in the hallways of these buildings. And as he was waiting for her to go backtrack and find this dollar, he wound up waiting a very long time. And to the point where he himself got scared, being alone, 8 years old, he started wandering around looking for her and backtracked where he thought she could have been. Well, sadly, he was the one to find his sister, partially naked, hanging by her blouse from a water spigot, sort of a pipe. And, of course, she was dead. Now, Richard had somehow lured this young girl into the basement where he would commit SA. He would then stab her to death before posing her in some type of satanic ritual of sorts and for people to find. He's, again, very sloppy, okay, not caring that he left all sorts of DNA everywhere. And again, stupid luck was on his side, as Linda's case would go unsolved for 25 years. Now, this was his first kill, and it was successful, which gave him the confidence and now a taste of blood. And with that, the remainder of 1984 all the way to August of 1985, a slew of random home invasions would terrify the residents of LA County. We're going to move to June 28 of 1984. 79-year-old Jenny Vinko was home alone in her apartment in Glasso Park, Los Angeles. She's 79 years old, guys. You could just imagine how helpless she would be against the likes of someone like Richard Ramirez, who broke into her home and forced himself upon her, committing SA and then stabbing her to death repeatedly, nearly decapitating her head in the process before fleeing into the night. He had committed his second killing, again leaving behind crucial evidence because he doesn't give a fuck. And he works for Satan, so he'll never get caught, right? But his fingerprint was found on the window that he let himself in with. Now, a chunk of time would go by, roughly 8 months. And I'm hesitant to say that Richard laid low in this time frame. I mean, I find it more easy to imagine that he just wasn't linked to whatever crime he was committing in this 8-month span. I really don't think these kinds of people can go dormant. March 17th of 1985. Now, the next time detectives would be assigned to a Night Stalker case, an obvious Night Stalker case, would be that of 20-year-old Maria Hernandez. Now, she had just pulled into her garage, turned off her car, grabbed her keys, and got out. And all of a sudden, she hears a loud bang on her car, which scared the shit out of her. She looks up and finds this tall, gangly man dressed in all black. But the most defining thing of that situation was that he had a gun aimed directly at her face. So instinctively, Maria does what? She covers her face. How much can a hand block a bullet? The perpetrator pulls the trigger and shoots her through the hand and directly in the face. The man would then enter her house. Now, if he's working for Satan, God was looking out for Maria, because by some miracle, Maria got up. The keys that she had been holding in her hand had deflected the bullet. So being dazed, she got up. She enters her house and she would find her roommate, 34-year-old Daily Okazaki, with a single bullet in her forehead, and unfortunately for her, she was deceased. Now, Maria would later give a detailed description of Richard Ramirez to the police, and from that crime scene, Richard was already on his way to his next thrill kill. Okay, he doesn't know anybody. These are all completely random, which just makes it even more blood-chilling. He's on foot, by the way, and he found himself in Monterey Park, tired and fiending for that next kill. And when that opportunity arose, he forcibly pulled 30-year-old Veronica Yu out of her car, and he got in. Now, he could have just driven away, but he chose to shoot her twice before speeding off. She would be pronounced dead at the hospital, and this, of course, would be all over the news that night. Southern California was at this point gripped in a panic because there was a clear serial killer on the loose. March 27, 1985. Now, this would be 10 days later from that last murder, as another home invasion with the Night Stalker's MO written all over it would happen to 64-year-old Vincent and his wife, 44-year-old Maxine Zaza. They were asleep in their house in Whittier when they would encounter the Night Stalker. Now, what made this particular house unique was that this wasn't the first time that Richard Ramirez would break into this specific house. Now, why he would want to terrorize this poor couple again, of course, is beyond me. So it was around 2 a.m. and Ramirez was already in their home. Now, shortly, he would be standing over Vincent and shooting him in the face. His death was quick, but I cannot say the same for Maxine, because as she was jolted awake by the loud boom, she was ordered to show Richard where all the valuables were. And once he had what he wanted, he seemed to have other plans for her. He had bound her hands and her legs, but he did a poor job of it, because as he was rummaging through the couple's drawers, he would turn around to find Maxine aiming a shotgun directly at him for once. And this fucking guy, I'm telling you, stupid luck was with him again, as if the devil was his guardian angel, because when Maxine pulled the trigger, all it did was click. Unfortunately, Vincent had merely put that shotgun under the mattress as a deterrent. It was not loaded. Richard Ramirez raised his .22 and killed Maxine with 3 shots. But this close call did leave him in some type of funk, some type of rage, because when detectives found her body, they saw that she was repeatedly stabbed after she had already died, as well as missing both her eyes. Richard had gouged them out, placed them in a jewelry box, and left. And of course, do I need to mention, he was incredibly sloppy. Richard would easily be linked to these killings of 10 days prior. He left his bullet shells there. He could have easily picked these up, cleaned up the crime scene a little bit, but I guess he was too busy being mad at a corpse. May 14, 1985. A month later, 66-year-old Bill Doy and his wife, 64-year-old Lillian, they were asleep in their Monterey Park home when they thought they heard an intruder. And of course, the MO was the same. First, take out the man. He shoots Bill in the face and brutally beat him into unconsciousness. Next was to have his way with the wife. He binds Lillian, forces her to show him where all the valuables are. Afterwards, he would her. Now, Bill Doy wouldn't die immediately, but he would wind up dying at the hospital later. And this is a clear sign that Ramirez was at this point starting to feel invincible, that he really did have Satan looking out for him, because he would let Lillian live. And although he did this, she would die 6 years later, and she was haunted pretty much every day for the remainder of those 6 years. May 29, 1985. So after having stolen another vehicle, knowing that the police would be looking for the previous one, he drives himself to Monrovia, California, where he would notice 83-year-old Mabel, also known as Ma Bell, and her disabled sister, 81-year-old Florence, known as Nettie Liang. Now, if you haven't realized by now, Ramirez only chooses the weakest of the pack to exploit, a cowardice trait for such a ruthless killer. Both these women would be found unconscious, bound, and bludgeoned. Florence would survive, and they learned from her that she was choked with a cord and then SA'd. Unfortunately for her sister Mabel, who met the exact same ordeal, she would not survive the attack. And this is also when they would learn for the first time about Ramirez's satanic worshiping, because they found a physical clue with Mabel's lipstick. He would use that to draw a pentagram on her body and on the walls. May 30, 1985. Now this would be the very following day. Okay, so now Ramirez is in Burbank. 42-year-old Carol Kyle and her 11-year-old son are spending a leisurely time together at home, and this would be interrupted when a lanky gunman breaks into their home. Now, he binds up Carol, he orders the young boy to lead him to the valuables, Night Stalker MO shit. He would then lock the child in the closet and proceed to S.A. Carol. She recalls him repeatedly telling her not to look at him or he's gonna cut her eyes out. Now, after he was done, he pulled the boy out of the closet, tied him to his mother, and fled the scene. July 2nd, 1985. Ramirez is now in Arcadia, California, in another stolen vehicle. This time, he had the eyes on 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon. He snuck in through her window, went into her kitchen, and found himself a 10-inch knife. He would find Mary resting in her bed. He would pick up a nearby lamp and mercilessly pummels the old woman's face until she is unconscious. He then takes that knife and stabs her multiple times. Now, it appeared that nothing was gained from this particular attack that may be the thrill of the killing, because he wouldn't steal anything, he wouldn't commit any type of SA. And it's really chilling if you want to think that maybe he was going through some type of withdrawal if he wasn't killing. July 5th, 1985. Now this is 3 days later, and we have Ramirez heading to Sierra Madre, California, where Whitney Bennett, just 16 years old, was asleep in her bed when Ramirez climbed in with a tire iron. Whitney is awakened in a daze with the first strike of that tire iron to the head. When she gathers her faculties, she is being strangled by a man on top of her. She cannot scream for help. She cannot even breathe at this point. Let's just say if Whitney didn't believe in a higher power before, she was about to, because Ramirez began to tighten the cord that he had grabbed with all his strength around her throat. Because he did this so fast and fervently, sparks began to fly from the wires. Now, as we know, Richard is very religious. He was just rooting for that other team. So when he saw the sparks, the only thing that occurred in his pea brain was that Jesus Christ was intervening. And when he heard Whitney take this giant breath, well, this frightened him, and he fled in fear. Now, Whitney would need almost 500 stitches to close those lacerations on her head, but hey, she survived to be another witness. July 7, 1985. Ramirez once again prowled the streets of Monterey Park, where 61-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson was sleeping soundly on her couch when a rain of punches came down on her face and her body. She falls to the floor, and Ramirez starts to kick and stomp on her head. This would continue until she was dead. And when the police found her body, the pattern of Ramirez's shoe was imprinted on her face. Now they knew he was wearing Avia sneakers, matching those found at previous crime scenes. But the night was still young for Ramirez. A few blocks down, 63-year-old Sophie Dickman would encounter the Night Stalker as well. He would handcuff the woman at gunpoint and commit SA. Now, after forcing her to tell him where the jewelry was, all the valuables, as always, this time he made her swear on Satan that she had given him everything. July 20, 1985. So Ramirez's activities at this point was quiet for about 2 weeks now, but the communities, of course, were still reeling by these horrific events. And it was on this date of July 20 that Richard Ramirez walks into a store and buys a machete. Okay, he starts driving to Glendale, California. Not only was he ready to kill again, but his thirst for blood at this point really seemed out of control. 66-year-old Leela and 68-year-old Maxine would be his next victims. With that machete, he hacks them to death while they were asleep. And he finishes them off with shots to the head, burglarizing their home and then speeding off. His next destination would be Sun Valley. Next, he would break into the Covenant house. Again, he kills the man at the house first, and his name was Chenarong Covenant. He then beats the man's wife, Samkid Covenant, and SAs her. Now, the commotion caused their 8-year-old son to rush into the room to see this nightmarish scene. Ramirez overpowers the boy, ties him up. He forces Samkid to lead him to the valuables and again forces his victim to swear to Satan that he was being given everything of value. He would leave that mother and child alive as well. August 6, 1985. Now, Ramirez again, he remains silent for about 2 weeks. And now we're going to be introduced to 27-year-old Chris and Virginia Peterson, who were fast asleep in their house. Virginia, being a light sleeper, was startled by a noise and sat up only to be shot in the face. Chris jumps out of bed and instinctively rushes at Ramirez and is shot in the temple. Now, adrenaline rushed through Chris's veins because he found himself in a struggle with the intruder. Ramirez fired 2 more shots but missed, managed to break free and fled the scene, and fortunately, both Chris and Virginia survived their wounds. August 8th, 1985. Now, this is 2 nights later, and now we have Ramirez breaking into a house in Diamond Bar, and this house belonged to Sakina and Elias Abawath, who are both sleeping. He would shoot Elias in the head and kill him instantly. He would then handcuff, beat, and SA Sakina. Their 3-year-old son walks into the room. Ramirez ties him up and continues assaulting his mother in front of him. He then forces her to give him all the valuables and to swear on Satan. After the Night Stalker left, Sakina is left in very bad shape. She is barely able to move from the SA, from the beatings that he gave her, but she mustered up the strength and she was able to untie her son. He's just 3 years old, and told him to go to the neighbors to ask for help. August 18, 1985. Now, the news of the Night Stalker had created so much heat in Southern California that Ramirez felt he needed to get out of town, which is unfortunate for Northern California, the Bay Area, because he was heading that way. His old stomping grounds. His first kill was in San Francisco. So Ramirez entered the home of an elderly couple named Pan. 66-year-old Peter was shot in the head while sleeping, and 62-year-old Barbara was beaten into submission. Now, he would commit SA and shoot her in the head as well. Ramirez again used his victim's lipstick to draw a pentagram, but also left this encryptic phrase, Jack the Knife, on the bedroom wall as well. But it was this particular case that the media did a tremendous disservice to the case for these hardworking detectives. They began to broadcast the evidence that the police had on the Night Stalker. To say that this infuriated detectives would be an understatement. The Night Stalker had been watching, and he would go to the Golden State Bridge sporting brand new shoes and dropping those eau de vias off that bridge. He would spend a few days up in the North Cali before again making his way back south. August 24th, 1985. Ramirez is now in Orange County, California, and he was parked in a neighborhood in Mission Viejo. He was surveying the houses for targets. 13-year-old James Romero III had just returned home with his father after a fun family vacation in Mexico, and the timing of their return was just simply poor because Just down the street was Richard Ramirez, and he was staring right at them as they were arriving home. Later, in the middle of the night, Ramirez pried open their window to let himself in, but it was just loud enough that 13-year-old James heard it. He listened intently, and he knew someone was in the house. Immediately, James rushed to wake up his father. Richard was still quietly making his way about this house when suddenly lights began to turn on all around him. He panicked because he's a coward. He quickly jumps out the window and flees, but he didn't go far. He hid in the shadows, probably in some bushes, and just waited for things to die down in the Romero household. Now, that was a close call, right? And he needs to be more smarter. But I'm telling you guys, Richard Ramirez is not capable of being smarter. So while he's laying back in the shadows, his desire to kill is just too much. I'm assuming because all he did was go to the next house and just break into their back door. 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his 29-year-old fiancée Inez Erickson were asleep. Now, Bill is awakened by the loud cocking of a gun and is promptly shot in the face 3 times. Now, we could assume that Ramirez was feeling invincible and arrogant. He would proudly inform Inez that he was indeed the Night Stalker, like a proud badge of honor, and he reveled in the fear that this name induced in her. He made her pledge to love Satan, all while beating her mercilessly. Now, after she led him to all the valuables, he tied her up with Bill's neckties and committed SA. Now, before he left, he made sure to tell Inez to remember to tell the police that the Night Stalker was here. Now, miraculously, Bill Carnes would survive those 3 shots to the face, having the bullets successfully removed surgically. And now we have to get back to 13-year-old James Romero. The situation that night left him unsettled because he's a normal human being. So now he's sitting in his room afraid, and he is staring out his window when he noticed, and this is in his own words, a weird-looking guy in black. He looked unnatural and suspicious to James, and he was able to do something so quick-witted that he would help detectives eventually bring down the Night Stalker. So what did James do? He made a mental note that the car was orange plus a few other basic descriptions of that car. But the main thing he did was he tried to memorize the license plate. Now, he was only able to partially make out just a few of those digits, but it was enough because 4 days later, an orange Toyota was abandoned on Wilshire, and it had the color, the partial plates that James had memorized, and from that, even though the Night Stalker clearly tried to scrub the car of his fingerprints, he left one on the rear view mirror. The print was then positively identified as Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter from Texas with a long rap sheet for traffic and drug violations. Along with it, a mugshot from just a year prior in 1984 when he was caught stealing cars. They were finally looking at the face of the Night Stalker. When the residents of California were dealing with a faceless killer with a terrifying moniker such as the Night Stalker, they were gripped with fear. But that would change when plastered all over the news. These restless communities watching intently, the face of a mere mortal came on the screen with the very simple name of Richard Ramirez. That fear turned into anger. The police chief would also fan those flames, stating, "We know who you are now, and very soon everyone else will. There will be no place to hide." On August 30th, 1985, Richard was supposed to visit his brother in Tucson, Arizona. Unfortunately for Richard, plans change, as they do every time, except this was mid-journey, so he simply reversed and returned back to Los Angeles. Now, during his commute, He didn't have access to the breaking news about the identity of the Night Stalker. Cell phones didn't exist back then. He had no clue that his face was already ingrained in everyone's mind. And in the early mornings of August 31st, he would casually walk into a convenience store. A group of elderly Hispanic women noticed him. He looked rather familiar. They positioned himself to get a better look, and suddenly one of them yelled out in fear, "The Matador!" It was translated from Spanish, simply meaning the killer. Now, Ramirez, at this time, you could say that he was more confused than worried. He just didn't know what was going on. That was until he saw the newspapers that had his face on the cover. Now, the following scene could be straight out of a movie. Ramirez runs out of the store. He takes his chances through the busy Santa Ana freeway, dodging cars as the chance of killer are directed his way. He makes it across and finds a momentary hiding spot until the commotion dies down. But the commotion never does. He starts to attempt carjacking one car after another unsuccessfully. How terrifying does that look to any onlookers? And this would of course garner him more unwanted attention as the surrounding public, who would also recognize him right away and create a bigger and bigger mob. And they chased the Night Stalker into the neighborhood of Boyle Heights, and by the time they reached Hubbard Street, a group of 10 citizens, angry citizens, one of which being the husband of one of the women he tried to carjack. In his rage, he was able to muster the strength to pull out a metal fence post, and he used that to strike Ramirez right on his noggin. And this would force Ramirez finally to his knees. The mob would close in on him. They were relentlessly beating the shit out of him. And by the time the police arrived, Ramirez had been severely beaten. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. On November 7th, 1989, Richard was sentenced to 19 respective death sentences in the state of California via gas inhalation. Now, through all this, he would never show a single ounce of remorse for what he did, even made light of things after his sentencing. He said shit like, "Big deal, that was always in the territory, see you in Disneyland." But because of California's lengthy appeals process, Ramirez would have likely died of old age before ever seeing this gas chamber anyhow. But on June 7th of 2013, when I read 2013, I didn't know that he had only died just a decade ago. Now, Richard Ramirez, at this point, he's 53 years old. He was arrested at 25, meaning that is 28 more years of wasted oxygen. He would die of lymphoma. Cancer got him first. And like most things relating to reality, we don't always get what we want. Well, we did have the moment where a few good citizens beat the shit out of him, but it still doesn't feel like the bad guy got his just desserts in this case, especially when we remember all the victims he murdered, as well as the ones he left behind to suffer. And those cooling off periods, when he went quiet, leaves me very uneasy, because he definitely has more victims, don't you think? If you guys would like to share something that you know about Richard Ramirez, hey, we'd love to read it. I'd love to read it. If you've never left me a comment before, this is your chance. I've always wanted to hear from you. So please let me know you exist. My name is Monks, and I'm getting to a point where I could possibly upload once a week, and I would love to have you here for them. Now, go protect the ones you love, and love the ones that protect you.